After more than 2 months, the latest round of high-level China-U.S. trade talks resumed in Washington, D.C. on Thursday. The world looks on with hope that a path can be found to ease market uncertainty. The new tariffs are due to take effect shortly, and political issues are being inserted into the mix. So, can the world's two largest economies find a way to de-escalate tensions and settle on areas of agreement? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and Jake Parker, Senior Vice President of China Operations of the U.S.-China Business Council. We'll also talk to Professor Jeffrey Telson from Peking University via satellite in Bangkok. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. For people that are watching the situation, it was a busy and a little dizzy Thursday as there were conflicting and confusing headlines about how the talks went. And luckily, by the end of it, there seemed to be optimism about some form of agreement being reached, the possibility of a deal being reached between the two sides. We did hear from President Trump himself that he will be meeting with Vice Premier Liu He on Friday. Let me start with you, Professor Gong here. Is that a sign, a hint, that things were indeed going well and we could see an agreement?
I think definitely all indications point to the fact that it's going pretty well. The fact that President Trump is going to see Vice Premier Liu He, I think it's in a few hours, I guess, in Washington, D.C. right now. And also the fact that he tweeted first that, he said China wants a deal, as do I, right? And then a few hours later, he made an announcement during the press conference that he said that it went pretty well. So I think these are all very good signs, and I think it's a little bit pleasant surprise to me, as we know that there's a couple of events leading to this round of talk hasn't been very pleasant. There's some speculation and there's also press coverage that this is not going to be done this time. But surprisingly, it appears that we're actually moving to a very good direction right now, and I'm hopeful that some kind of a big announcement will come, hopefully by the end of Friday in Washington, D.C.
You're hopeful, Mr. Parker. Where are your hopes at? Are you feeling optimistic about this round?
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get to put a floor under the de-escalating tit-for-tat tariff increases that we've seen over the last couple of months. This is not going to be a solution that resolves all the issues in the bilateral trade relationship. This isn't going to address industrial policy. It's not going to address subsidies. It's not going to address SOE reform. But what it is going to address is it's going to focus on trade deficits. There's probably going to be some movement on intellectual property rights protection. We may be seeing something in investment liberalizations. The sorts of things that will help build momentum for the two sides to continue negotiations to build to a more larger sustainable deal in the future.
Professor Telson in Bangkok, let me come to you now. This has been a 15-month-long conflict between the two sides, and along the way situations change, political situations and economic realities change around the conflict itself, possibly providing more incentives or less incentives. That's possible for the two sides to come to the table and reach a deal. How do you read the current timing of this latest round?
Well, it's almost like we have a trend going up and a trend going down. One trend going up is the number of issues on the table keeps increasing. It started with trade, then it became economic, then it became tech, now it's almost cultural. So the scope of the disagreement or discussion keeps growing. But at the same time, both parties have sort of done their various moves on tariffs and responses, and you see sort of an understanding that, okay, we can't force the other side to do what we want, and you can kind of see them coming back to the table and saying, well, let's work on something if we can. So I think the timing is probably overall in favor of getting something done. The longer this goes on, there is somewhat more pressure on both sides to work this out.
Both sides have exhibited goodwill gestures. For the United States, that's the postponement of an earlier deadline for tariff hikes to October 15th. That's next week. And for China, it's the ramping up of the purchase of farm products, soybeans, pork from the United States. Do you think that is a positive sign and step in the right direction? Is that enough for the two sides to, to be more willing for a deal this time?
I would look for maybe two things to happen in the next week that I think are possible. One is an agreement, let's not escalate anymore. Let's postpone the tariff hikes on both sides that are, October 15th, December 15th. And then two, let's find something that's doable. It's not everything, but it could be soybeans. It could be the currency deal that was worked out at the start of this year. So maybe a hold your guns on one side, and then let's get something simple done on the other side. That would be kind of my cautious optimism for this.
Yeah, all three of you agree that things need to be escalated, and both sides are willing to do just that. Let's talk about what's been reported as a mini deal, a first phase agreement that's been in the works, and that could happen this time around. Mr. Parker talked about some of the things that could go into this mini deal. Professor Gong, your take on?
Well, remember I think a couple of weeks ago, Kudra came out and saying that the deal is 90% done, right? That's what he said. So my conjecture is that what's going to go into this deal right now definitely is going to include some of the structural issues. I think you mentioned. I know there are very thorny issues within the broader category of structural issues. For example, industrial policy, it could be a pretty tough problem.
Including subsidies.
Including subsidies, right. But I think issues with respect to access to market, intellectual property protection, forced transfer of technology, these issues I think can be easily addressed. I think it should be already resolved belonging to 90% of the deal that Kudra was referring to. And I think in this time, it is also this report about the deal about the currency. And I think this is very important. It helps American exports to China, and also helps with stabilizing the exchange rate situation. I also want to add a note about the idea that Professor Telson talked about expanding scope of the deal. I think this dispute is still very much centered on two issues. One is trade deficit from U.S. perspective. The other is the structural issues. The other things I think are most of them are brought in by President Trump. For example, about the technology, about Huawei. These things are brought in by President Trump as kind of a means to exert some pressure on the negotiation. I mean, these are not the core part of the negotiation.
Bargaining chips.
These are bargaining chips, exactly. So, as long as we can address, I think from my personal perspective, I think the trade issue is less of a concern. I think China is willing to address that, to balance the trade. The more thorny issues are in some aspects of the structural requests that the United States wants, and some of these things will touch upon the core system of our economic framework, and that's going to be quite difficult. Other than that, I think both sides should be at least willing to come to some kind of agreement, a middle ground, a lot easier than a few weeks ago.
If these thorny and larger issues that Professor Gong talked about will not go into this temporary agreement for now, what will this short agreement do to both sides besides cooling down the very fractious relations? And do you look at it as a down payment somehow to future solutions of issues down the road?
Yeah, call it a down payment, call it an early harvest. I think the thing that we're looking for at the end of this weekend is some kind of announcement that the October 15 tariffs are likely to be either continually delayed or canceled. Then we have the December 15 tariff increases for List 4 Part B. We'd also like to see some delay or cancellation of that. Ultimately, I think we'll see a beginning process where Ambassador Lighthizer, Secretary Mnuchin likely come to Beijing, likely in advance of the APEC meeting, where we could potentially see the two presidents meet, President Trump, President Xi. That would be a good inflection point for announcing some additional breakthroughs beyond just what we'll see at the end of this weekend.
And Professor Telson, your take on what this possible deal, of course, we've yet to find out. It's very early morning in the United States. What do you think could possibly go into this deal, if there is to be a deal?
I mean, I think definitely the delaying of any more escalation, especially, you know, the escalations that are scheduled for October 15th, December 15th. These are very, very large. I mean, these are not small steps. So I don't think people really want to go there, not as long as parties are talking. And then I think it's something incremental. I'm not a big believer in the idea that you're going to get a big deal that solves this. I think we are sort of watching the U.S. and China learn to engage with each other and deal with issues, and there's going to be a lot of issues now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. These are, you know, two very important but different countries learning to deal with each other. So if there's any steps in that regard, currency, maybe some IP issues, fentanyl, something like that, you know, I would consider any steps forward to be sort of progress in that process.
If you're not a believer of a big deal ever being reached, I thought that's what you meant. How will this proceed? I mean, the larger issues that we talked about, industrial policies and subsidies, the alleged forced transfer of technology, all of these issues, will they be solved gradually down the road after this temporary deal is reached, or will they just, you know, pan out and as the two sides realize that they're never going to solve all of them?
Right. I think you're looking at there's a lot of areas where China and the U.S. are absolutely in lockstep. They have the same interests, you know, AI, technology, my area, they work a lot on this very, very well. Other areas like industrial policy, that is a very core part of China's political economic system. And it's been incredibly successful. So I don't see that changing. So there are all structural issues where it's just going to be, okay, we agree to disagree and let's work where we can. And that would, you know, anything the U.S. and China can both work on constructively is going to be good for the world, because these are the two big economies.
All right, Professor Gong, you mentioned one of Trump's tweets saying that, you know, big deal negotiations with China, they want to make a deal, but do you think he wants to make a deal now? Do you think the Americans and the Chinese, who are more ready and willing to make that deal?
I think from President Trump's perspective, he's definitely more willing to make a deal than he was probably several months ago. You know,
what has changed for him?
Well, the political climate in Washington has definitely changed. He's facing, you know, this huge crowd of impeachment from Congress, and his prospect of being re-elected again is certainly tarnished, I think. So he understands that probably, you know, if we don't have a deal now, we probably will never have a deal if, you know, he's not going to be elected. So, you know, he understands that, I think. And I also want to mention that the U.S. economy is also not going so well, just like every economy right now around the world, including China's too. So I think world political leaders and, you know, the leaders from the World Bank, from IMF, from WTO, all come out and said that you know, we need to de-escalate this. We can't, you know, go on like this anymore. China and U.S. being the two largest economies in the world, being the locomotives of the world economy, have to sit down and work out something. Otherwise, it's just going to be disastrous for everyone. So I think he's facing these pressures, and he probably, I mean, he's being a very shrewd business person. I think he understands that it's about time to, you know, to come agreement and make a deal here.
Mr. Trump has a lot on his plate, definitely, but how do his considerations for re-election and the domestic political calculations fit into his willingness to strike a deal with China? Mr. Parker.
Well, I think one of the key factors that's playing out in the United States these days is related to the agricultural and agrarian communities that are big Trump voters in the United States. They've been some of the most deeply impacted by the U.S.-China trade conflict, particularly.
But there are subsidies in place to help them.
Not enough. It is
not enough.
Drop in a bucket, I guess.
Yeah,
right?
and when you talk to farmers, they talk about they want trade. They don't want subsidies. And there's an important identity that's involved with being market-oriented as a farmer in the United States. And
but Mr. Trump had to know that this crucial support base of him was going to bear the brunt of the tariffs.
I think it's really important for people to know. One of the questions that I ask farmers when I talk to them in the United States is, how is it that you continue to support someone who's working so deeply against your economic interests? And the response, I think, is quite interesting. They say, look, I agree with President Trump on abortion, on the Supreme Court, on the tax reform. I agree with him on 9 out of 10 issues. On the one that has a big impact on me, it's true, I disagree. But where else am I going to go? Am I going to go for the guy who I disagree with on 9 issues but agree on with 1? So this is a strong and firm base that will continue to support President Trump, we think, regardless of how long this plays out. But it is having a negative impact on their operations, and they would, I think, like to be trading with China if they could.
Farm products and agriculture is one thing. The overall U.S. economy, analysts have said that the risk for recession is real. Does that play into Mr. Trump's thinking and considerations?
Well, keep in mind that we've already have some tariffs already, and the impact of these tariffs are starting to show. I think American public is starting to realize that the prices are quietly coming up, and they got to be thinking about these tariffs. So people start to understand that this is something that it's not just Chinese companies paying for this. The American public is also paying for this. So when things start to hit people's pockets, I think it's going to show at the poll. And especially, as we all understand, the politics in the United States, presidential election is pretty much determined by a couple of swing states, and say Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, these swing states, Michigan. It's also very important, and there's actually a very large farming community in these states. So the votes from the farmers are very important. So I think he understands that, and so he must be thinking. I mean, I think the first priority for President Trump right now is re-election. There's no doubt about it in my mind that this is the first priority for him, and he's willing to do anything.
And for any president who wants a second term, well, that's each and every one of them. You'd have to have a decent economy. In the case of the one-term presidents, the economy was in trouble. Do you think Mr. Trump his priorities now are the re-election 2020? He simply has to have a deal to win. Does he feel that way?
I think every politician's #1 priority is getting re-elected. In President Trump's case...
But does he need a deal with China? Does he feel that he needs a deal with China to do that?
So one of our members told me an interesting statistic that helps me contextualize this issue. In the United States, we hear a lot about building the wall with Mexico, and that's clearly one of President Trump's big tropes that he rolls out on the campaign. However, this person told me that the trade conflict with China polls 6 times better than the wall on the Mexican border. It just goes to show you that this is an important issue for many of President Trump's constituencies, and actually being in a conflict, it insulates President Trump from criticism from both the left and the right. So while he's in the trade conflict politically, it's actually quite good for him. Economically, there are risks, but there are both positives and benefits there are both negatives and positives to the situation that need to be taken into consideration.
Besides the general economic picture here, you talked about how farmers suffered, and another sector that suffered is manufacturing. Low PMI figures show continued contraction in the U.S. manufacturing. Has the United States, has the Trump administration tariffed its way into a manufacturing recession here?
Well, the theory is actually the exact opposite. I mean, the tariff is supposed to be working in a way to drive corporate America operating here in China, they're mostly in manufacturing, to move their operation back to the United States. I mean, that's Peter Navarro's theory. I mean, he's so preoccupied and fixated on manufacturing, building back the manufacturing base in the United States. So that's the theory. But I think he probably succeeded to some extent that some companies are actually indeed thinking about leaving China. And this is true not just because of these tariffs, but also because of the broader, larger trend, the broader trend of manufacturing out of China because of the rising costs, labor costs and other costs in China. And historically, manufacturing always migrates. It just doesn't stay in a country for forever. I mean, it migrates from Europe to North America, from North America to Japan and South Korea and to China. Been staying in China for 30 years. So manufacturing is starting to move out of China, and And some of these companies, I think, indeed are driven by the tariffs consideration. Also the concern about uncertainty between the United States and China's broader relationship. So, they're thinking about leaving. But so far, I don't see any empirical evidence to say that this kind of a trend is actually helping the manufacturing in the United States. There's no strong evidence that the manufacturing is moving back to the United States. If ever it moves back to the United States, moving back in another way, it's not creating the kind of jobs that we're wishing for, but more likely, it's another kind of manufacturing, more based on robotics and other more capital-intensive investment. So tariffs certainly doesn't help with creating jobs in the manufacturing sector in the United States. At least I don't see any significant empirical evidence so far.
We've talked a lot about how external factors might have changed and provided more ideal conditions for this round of talks. Mr. Parker, do you think in terms of how the two sides negotiate, their tactics have changed also?
Yeah, I think there's two traps here that needed to be crossed before we could get to any kind of de-escalation. The first was showing visible progress to President Trump personally. The second is the structural issues. And on the visual progress side, I think this time we've seen the Chinese adopt some new tactics. One, they're making agricultural purchases without any kind of expectation of something in return. That's a little different from what we saw after the Osaka round, when there seemed to be a little bit of a miscommunication. China expected some kind of export licenses for Huawei. The Trump administration expected agricultural purchases. Neither side was willing to go first, and that ended up in nothing happening and President Trump imposing tariffs. What we see this round is the Chinese are making proactive, unilateral agricultural purchases, no expectation for something in return. The second point, and this one's really important for people to understand, fentanyl is absolutely critical to President Trump. And one of the senior administration officials who focuses on drug policy came to China 2 weeks ago, and the Chinese government promised intelligence sharing. They promised to do additional screening on postal packages. They were promised to do increased enforcement and arrests domestically. That's really important to President Trump. So I think that these actions have created a positive atmosphere that allowed the two sides to get at the structural and substantive issues a little more directly.
That's progress on the Chinese side. Do you feel that the Chinese have changed their tactics? Do you, whether the United States has changed their tactics?
Well, first of all, I think it's very interesting news to me, actually. I think it's a very good sign that we really need to shut it down. I think fentanyl is a cancer, it's a poison, killing a lot of Americans in the United States, and we need to really shut it down. But in terms of the change of tactics, I think my guess, well, first of all, the details of these talks is really keeping secret. We really know what's going on. But my conjecture is that President Trump's stance probably softens a little bit. He's probably more willing to make kind of some concessions. Remember, a few days ago, he was saying, he doesn't want to do a temporary deal, right? He was saying, I want a big deal, or either no deal or big deal, right? And I also read another interview by his chief trade advisor, Peter Navarro. He was talking about President Trump's steely resolve, and he said he doesn't want to do a sort of a small deal, limited deal. He wants to do a big deal. But what we are reading right now is indication that something sort of in the interim, something of a limited scale, and both sides will keep talking.
It may be a little early to talk about this. We don't even know if there's going to be a deal this time around. But some people are saying that the two sides are more willing for a deal this time is because they have realized that a big, comprehensive deal satisfying both sides simply might not happen because China has been very persistent, very constant with its stance coming into these talks. And this has prompted a lot of people to talk about the decoupling of the two nations. Some call it the great fracture, where the two sides are trying to create very different set of rules and competing worlds to the both sides. How do you understand the decoupling?
I think I think we all would accept that the United States-China policy has to really change, and it's going to change for good. Very different from several years ago. It's going to be a combination of both competition and cooperation. And on the competition side, I think the most important aspect of competition is technology competition. This is absolutely important to the United States from the perspective of reserving those high-paying jobs, as well as maintaining U.S. defense, supremacy. I mean, that's a goal that's being held very much to the heart of politicians in Washington, D.C. So, given this environment, the issue is whether these tactics and strategies and policies with respect to technology competition or technology decoupling is going to spread out into other areas, into economic areas, into cultural exchanges, people-to-people exchanges. And I think it's almost inevitable that to some degree it's going to affect other aspects of things I've just talked about. The issue is how do we actually manage and control that? We don't want to have a sort of across-the-board decoupling. At this time, I think it's almost impossible to talk about reversing this technology decoupling. It's coming, and I think we have to accept that. Chinese companies keep in mind that you have to do all things on your own. You have to innovate on your own. The days of trying to have technology transfer and re-innovate, these days are gone forever, I think. So my point is that we should limit this kind of decoupling maybe in the technology area, but not spreading to other areas.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time left, Mr. Parker. I want to hear your take on this so-called decoupling or fracture between the two sides.
I think that selective decoupling is going to be the norm going forward. And part of it's tech-related, part of it's investment-related, a big part of it's national security-related. If you talk to folks in the U.S. government, there are concerns about the over-reliance on the China market for specifically technology-related supply chains. And many of our U.S. member company executives are hearing from the Trump administration to try and highlight these concerns. We also know that the U.S. administration is working on new export control measures that would redefine foundational and emerging technologies and probably narrow the amount of sharing of technology that can be done with countries like China in the future. So I think this is one where we're only beginning, we're in the very initial stages of. We're likely to see more on it in the future.
All right, it's early morning U.S. time. We should find out soon enough if there's going to be a deal this time. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Professor Gong, Mr. Parker, and of course Professor Telson joining us from Bangkok earlier. Thank you so much for watching Dialogue today. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing.